Hello, Dr. Albrecht.
Yeah, hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Indonesian time. Are you ready, or do we need to wait around seven minutes to start?
In my opinion, we could start. So
Okay,
it depends on you. So if everybody
okay.
is there attending, so we could start, I would say.
I think we can start, and everyone's ready. So,
Yeah,
yeah. Before we start, I would like to give some introduction and some um, yeah, introduction to the session and introduction to our speaker today. Our speaker today is Dr. Felix Albrecht from Georg-August-Universität Göttingen, and he's delivering a presentation on the Psalmi Salomonis, or Psalms of Solomon. And regarding his academic education, he got his PhD from Georg-August-Universität Göttingen, 2006 to 2008, and also his uh, other educational background, bachelor, Georg-August-Universität Göttingen, and also Pontificia Università Gregoriana di Roma. And his scientific degrees, his diploma uh, theology is from also from from Christian Albrecht University Kiel 2008, and he received his Dr. Theol in Georg-August-Universität Göttingen. He also has a professional career after completing degrees. One of them is Arbeitsstellenleiter, die Editio Critica Major des griechischen Psaltes, Göttingen Academy of Sciences and Humanities, since 2020, and also other professional career as well. And he also um, he's also active in further scientific activities. Some of them are editor of supplements to the Göttingen Septuaginta SGS, together with Reinhard Kratz, Göttingen, van den Hoek, and Ruprecht since 2024, and also editorial board of Parabiblica in Tübingen, Moa Ziebeck since last year, 2023, and also editorial board of De Septuaginta Investigaciones in Göttingen. And yeah, there are also many publications that he already did. Some of the selected publications are essays on the Psalms of Solomon, its cultural background, significance, and interpretation, Parabiblica 2, published in Göttingen, and also Editionen und Studien zum Testamentum Salomonis, Parabiblica 1, Tübingen, and editing the Septuagint, and also vom Bernstein zum Luchstein, der im Hebräischen mit Ischem bezeichnete Stein und seine Äquivalente in Septuaginta und Vertus Latina, and also die Psalmen Salomos, griechische Text nebst neudeutscher Übersetzung und Gesamtregister Göttingen. And the list goes on, but for now we will listen to his presentation about the Psalms of Solomon. Please, Dr. Albrecht.
thank you. And I switch so that you can see my presentation. Do you see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank our hosts and the organizers of this seminar for inviting me to speak with you today. It is truly an honor to join you, albeit virtually from afar, and to participate in this event in Jakarta, Indonesia, via Zoom. Since 2008, I've been working in the field of Septuagint research at the Göttingen Academy of Sciences and Humanities, focusing on the Greek Old Testament. In parallel, I served as an assistant in the New Testament department at the theological faculty of the University of Göttingen, where I taught an introductory course on the New Testament for 6 years. I've always been intrigued by King Solomon, which led me to take an interest in the Psalms of Solomon. And over the course of 10 years, I produced a critical edition of these psalms. This edition was published in 2018 as part of the Göttingen Septuagint series. 2 years later, my bilingual Greek-German annotated edition of the Psalms of Solomon appeared, and just 2 weeks ago, my Russian translation and commentary was published. In my lecture entitled The Psalms of Solomon and Textual Criticism, I will introduce you to the Psalms of Solomon, an ancient collection of prayerful texts composed roughly 2 millennia ago. Despite their age, these psalms continue to resonate with us and remain remarkably relevant. After providing an overview of the Psalms of Solomon, I will turn our attention to the discipline of textual criticism. I've chosen 3 specific psalms for our focus. I will begin by highlighting their theological significance and then use an exemplary verse from each to show how textual critics strive to establish and interpret the most reliable form of the biblical text. Together, we will consider how scribal practices, manuscript variants, and scholarly methodologies influence our understanding of these prayerful texts. We have up to 1 hour for the presentation, after which I will be happy to take your questions. I hope this arrangement not only gives me an opportunity to share insights, but also provides you with the chance to engage with the material and address any uncertainties you may have. The Psalms of Solomon is a collection of 18 psalms, largely from the 1st century BC, that have been transmitted under the name of King Solomon in the context of the Septuagint. The Hebrew original is lost, while the Greek and Syriac translations are preserved. Whether there was ever a Hebrew Vorlage, that means original, is questionable. The Psalms of Solomon are fascinating not only because of their content, but also because of the history of their composition. Originating in a time full of political and religious changes, they give us authentic insights into the world of faith, the prayers, feelings, and thoughts of Greek-speaking Palestinian Judaism. The roots go back to the 2nd century BC, when the Hasmoneans ruled the land and the pious played an important role. In the further course of tradition, these psalms are likely to have circulated in Pharisaic circles. Many of these psalms appear to be inspired by significant historical events. For example, the first 2 psalms vividly describe the war and conquest of Jerusalem in 63 BC by the Romans under the leadership of Pompey. The feelings of the people become clear as we read how the city walls were broken down and the holy place of the temple was desecrated. Such emotional and detailed descriptions allow us to empathize with the pain and hopes of the people of that era. Gradually, these psalms were expanded and eventually compiled into the collection we recognize today. They received their final form in the 1st century CE, probably during the reign of Agrippa I, 41 to 44 CE. Knowing this background helps us to understand the Psalms of Solomon in their historical context and to recognize their significance for us today. In times of change and uncertainty, they offer comfort and show the constancy of faith. 11 Greek minuscule manuscripts transmit the Psalms of Solomon. The direct witnesses on the one hand and indirect on the other do not provide a uniform picture of the transmission history. According to the direct witnesses of the Greek manuscript transmission, the Psalms of Solomon follow the wisdom of Solomon. The matching transmission context of the thematically divergent manuscripts Ralph's 253 and 260 shows that this must have been the original transmission context of the archetype. The fact that in addition to the title Psalms of Solomon and the manuscripts 260 and 769, the title Wisdom of Solomon, manuscript Rives 253 in the Greek, and manuscript S in the Syriac tradition, is also erroneously attested for the Psalms of Solomon, is an indication that the antecedent manuscript stood in the direct context of the Wisdom of Solomon. How old this position is can hardly be determined with certainty, but the Syriac manuscript S, which dates from the 7th century, offers a solid point of reference. The Psalms of Solomon are therefore part of the deuterocanonical books of wisdom due to the attribution of the collection to the wise King Solomon. In the mainstream of tradition, the wisdom books form a unit of 6 books consisting of the canonical books Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Canticum, Job, whereby the position of the book of Job fluctuates, and the deuterocanonical books Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach. In the side stream of the tradition, the deuterocanonical wisdom books Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach are supplemented by the Psalms of Solomon. In addition, the Psalms of Solomon have been transmitted in 2 cases following a catena of psalms, namely in the manuscripts Rives 629 and 769. The indirect evidence from the Church Fathers and in the canon lists presents a somewhat different picture, showing that the Psalms of Solomon lost their traditional place within the deuterocanonical wisdom books in the course of time and were gradually moved to the margins of the canon. In the synopsis of the Holy Scriptures of Pseudo-Athanasius, 6th century, the Psalms of Solomon are listed under the title Antilegomena, which refers to those writings that are contradicted according to church doctrine, in the context of the deuterocanonical books of the Septuagint, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Esther, Judith, Tobit, 1 to 4 Maccabees, Psalms of Solomon, Odes of Solomon, and Susanna. Similarly, the Stichometry of Nikephoros, 9th century, lists the Psalms of Solomon among the Antilegomena, directly following the deuterocanonical books of wisdom after Sirach, thus also Alfred Rives in his manual edition. 1 to 3 Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Psalms of Solomon, Odes of Solomon, Esther, Judith, Susanna, Tobit. Both canon lists still give an idea of the original deuterocanonical transmission context. In the so-called Catalogue of 60 books, which is transmitted, for instance, in the appendix to the questions and answers of Anastasius Sinaites, 7th century, and which has a long history of influence. The offshoots can be found in the Armenian and Slavonic traditions. The Psalms of Solomon are described as apocryphal, whereby the German church historian Theodor Zahn has proven that the original list of the Catalogue of 60 books included the Psalms of Solomon among the Antilegomena. The resolutions of the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century expressed the prohibition of non-canonical psalms. Both John Sonaras, 12th century, and Theodorus Balsamon, who was dependent on him, refer this to the Psalms of Solomon. This interpretation has much in its favor as it is able to explain the historical evidence. While the Psalms of Solomon originally ran under the deuterocanonical wisdom books, as the Greek primary tradition shows, they gradually moved to the margins of the canon. First to the Antilegomena, see Pseudo-Athanasius and Nikephoros, as well as the original list of the Catalogue of 60 books, and at the end to the Apocrypha, see the Catalogue of 60 books. The canonical transmission of the Psalms of Solomon was probably already stopped in the 4th century by the decision of Laodicea. It is therefore hardly surprising that the great majuscule codices of the 4th century, Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and the 5th century Codex Alexandrinus do not list the Psalms of Solomon in a canonical place that is among the deuterocanonical wisdom books. In the case of the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus, it is unclear whether they included the Psalms of Solomon at the end. In the case of the 5th century Codex Alexandrinus, however, the index of the manuscript reveals that the Psalms of Solomon were originally added after the New Testament. Codex Alexandrinus also testifies to the status of the book after the Council of Laodicea, which had marginalized it from the canon. In view of the fact that the Psalms of Solomon have survived in comparatively few manuscripts, one thing is all the more striking: their transmission is linked to the Byzantine imperial court. Manuscript Reis 769 stands out due to its writing material, an example of very old Occidental paper, and can therefore be located with good reason in the environment of the Byzantine imperial chancellery. And manuscript Reis 260, together with its copy Reis 149, is designed as a magnificent imperial manuscript, the production of which probably dates to the time of Constantine VII, and whose tradition in the Paleologan era is linked to the imperial ruling family of the Cantacuzenoi. After all, it is part of the so-called Bible of Niketas. That's Reis manuscripts 90, 719, and 260. This very Bible of Niketas, what you see on the screen are the 12 minor prophets, provides an astonishing insight into the fate of the Psalms of Solomon in the Byzantine era. Cavallo has succeeded in proving that the copy produced at the end of the 10th century is based on a late antique model dated to the year 535. This Justinian model was probably written in 2 or 3 columns in biblical majuscule. According to Cavallo and Belting, it already contained full-page miniatures, among which was the author's portrait of Solomon, known from manuscript Reis 260, folio 83 verso, which had been faithfully copied from this original. Having established the broader historical and literary context of the Psalms of Solomon in the first part of this presentation, we now turn to a more focused examination of these texts through the lens of textual criticism. Textual criticism, in essence, seeks to reconstruct as closely as possible the earliest attainable form of a text by analyzing its surviving witnesses. This process involves comparing multiple manuscript traditions, scrutinizing variations in wording, line divisions, and punctuation, and considering the cultural and scribal practices that shaped the text's transmission over time. Although it is a meticulous and often painstaking endeavor, textual criticism allows us to discern underlying patterns of scribal error, deliberate modification or misinterpretation, and thereby gain deeper insight into the text's original meaning and historical reception. In this second part, I shall present 3 illustrative examples. For each, I will first display the critical text as established in my text critical edition, followed by an English translation that reflects the nuances identified during the editorial process. This will prepare us to examine each case in detail, explaining the specific textual problems, the methods applied to resolve them, and the significance of the resulting emendations or confirmations. By engaging closely with these examples, we will not only appreciate the complexity and subtlety of the Psalms of Solomon's textual history, but also learn how the rigorous application of textual criticism reveals fresh insights and new discoveries within these ancient poetic compositions. My first example is Psalm of Solomon 11. Of Solomon concerning expectation. Blow a signal trumpet of holiness in Zion, proclaim in Jerusalem with the voice of one who brings good news, for God has shown mercy to Israel when he visited them. Stand upon a heat, O Jerusalem, and behold your children. gathered at once from east and west by the Lord. From the north they come rejoicing in their God. From distant islands God has assembled them. He has humbled lofty mountains into level ground for them. The hills have retreated at their coming. The forests provided shade for them on their journey. Every fragrant tree God caused to spring forth for them, so that Israel might pass through under the oversight of the glory of their God. Clothe yourself, O Jerusalem, in the garments of your splendor. Prepare the attire of your sanctuary. For God has spoken good things for Israel for all eternity and beyond. May the Lord fulfill what he has promised concerning Israel and Jerusalem. May the Lord raise up Israel in the name of his glory. May the Lord's mercy be upon Israel forever and still further. Psalms of Solomon 11 unfolds as a vibrant declaration of hope and divine fidelity. We find a vision of Israel's restoration presented with vivid imagery that speaks both to the imagination and the heart. The psalm depicts God as the one who gathers his people from every direction, east, west, and north, even from remote islands, promising an end to exile and dispersion. This is not a scattered people returning to a barren land. Rather, the landscape itself responds to God's redemptive work. High mountains are leveled, hills yield before the people's approach, and even forests and fragrant trees spring forth as a hospitable canopy. In these images, the psalm conveys that the world bends graciously to God's saving will. At the center of this text stands Jerusalem, beckoned to stand tall, arrayed once more in garments of holiness and majesty. The city's renewed splendor is not self-derived, but granted by God's compassionate visitation. Here, visitation suggests more than a cursory presence. It implies active divine involvement and care, a personal intervention that brings mercy and renewal. The divine presence is intimately engaged, shaping conditions for Israel's return. Likewise, the term Israel in this context signifies not merely a collective noun for a historical people, but the covenant community cherished by God, a people defined by their relationship to him rather than by geography alone. The Lord's promise of good things for Israel extends beyond a single moment. His mercy spans eternity. This comprehensive pledge addresses both ancient fears and future uncertainties, assuring that God's favor and care know no temporal bound. The psalm is an ancient song of hope depicting the divine shepherd gathering his scattered flock and guiding them home. From a scholarly perspective, it exemplifies how textual nuance and historical awareness illuminate subtle layers of meaning. As a pastoral message, this psalm stands as a timeless reminder that no matter the apparent obstacles, God's faithful presence endures, ensuring that his people shall ultimately find rest in his promised care. Let me explain two things further. First, God's visitation, and second, what does Israel mean for us? In the ancient Near Eastern and biblical context, the term episkopē, commonly rendered as visitation, often conveys the idea of attentive oversight. God's visitation is not a mere passing observation, it is a purposeful act of deliverance and restoration. By employing this term, the psalmist suggests that God closely watches over his people, intervening in their history at critical moments. Rather than connoting a punishment, as it sometimes can in biblical literature, here visitation emphasizes divine mercy and the initiation of renewal. It implies God's willingness to re-establish right order, uphold justice, and ensure that his covenant people are not abandoned to their plight. And what does Israel mean? Although the term Israel originally referred to the descendants of the patriarch Jacob, And this psalm bears theological weight rather than being merely an ethnic or political designation. Israel stands for the people chosen and sustained by God's promise, those who remain under his watchful guidance. The text envisions a restored Israel gathered at once from every corner of the earth, underscoring that the true unity and identity of God's people transcends geography and dispersion. Israel here symbolizes the ongoing relationship between God and his covenant community, a people defined by divine calling, cherished heritage, and eternal promise. This understanding allows the faithful to see themselves within Israel's story as recipients of a mercy that stretches across time and space. Our first example, a variant reading in Psalms of Solomon 11:7, will serve as an initial case study before we turn to two additional passages that further illustrate the challenges and methodologies involved in reconstructing the original sense of these ancient writings. First, let us look at the variants themselves. One tradition of the text reads, Hodiotos elalesen agata Israel esten ton Iona kai eti. Another tradition attested in a certain manuscript group designated Ralph's 769 rearranges the text as Hodiotos elalesen agata eston Iona kai eti Israel. At first glance, the difference might seem minor. One version reads, God has spoken good things for Israel forever and more, while the other appears to say, God has spoken good things forever and more, Israel. Yet such a shift can significantly alter our understanding of the verse's syntactic structure and its poetic rhythm. Our task is to determine which version reflects the original intention of the composer and to understand how and why the corruption might have occurred. The variant found in Ralph's 769 likely arises from a misunderstanding of the text's stichographic layout, essentially the way the original copy presented the text in lines or cola. The Psalms of Solomon, like many ancient poetic works, were often copied with attention to line divisions that reflected the original stichometry or poetic cola. When scribes transmitted texts over centuries, they had to rely on manuscript copies that might have contained line breaks, indentations, or other scribal marks meant to signal the text's poetic structure. In this case, I've reconstructed the following original arrangement: Hodiotos elalesen agata Israel, eiston Iona kai eti. Note how Israel stands at the end of the first colon, while forever and more, eiston Iona kai eti, stands at the beginning of the second colon. This structuring helps maintain the poem's balance and ensures that the object Israel is clearly the recipient of the good things that God has spoken. In other words, the text praises God's enduring benevolence towards Israel. The question is now, how did the corruption arise? The corrupted tradition can be explained if the word Israel was written or perceived by a scribe as having been placed lower down or subscripted at the line's end due to space constraints. Ancient manuscripts often faced layout challenges. When the line was too long, a scribe might place the final word below the line or at the line's extreme end. If the following line began with something like eiston Iona kai eti, a later scribe unfamiliar with the original intention or the stichographic cues might have reinserted Israel after the phrase forever and more, thereby shifting the semantic and syntactic balance of the line. In manuscript Ralph's 336, it is noted that such positioning at the end of the line is a known phenomenon. The scribe of Ralph's 769 evidently misunderstood this arrangement and thought that Israel was intended to appear after forever and more, thereby creating a misplaced word order. Such small errors, once introduced into the tradition, could be perpetuated by subsequent scribes who simply copied what lay before them, unaware that an error had been introduced. This example illuminates one of the core skills in textual criticism: the ability to detect errors introduced by scribes due to misinterpretation of the text's physical layout. A textual critic must consider not only the words themselves, but also the manuscript context, how the lines are arranged, the spacing, and any peculiarities in the script or punctuation. When we confront a variant reading, we ask which reading makes the most sense in terms of syntax, semantics, poetic structure, and the known habits of scribes. Restoring the text to true cola, 7c and 7d, is the correct approach. The older editions read in one line, Hotiotos, Lalesen Agata Israeles Tonaiona Kaeti. In my critical edition, I have reconstructed the ancient stichic layout in 2 lines. By doing so, the clause flows logically, attributing good things to Israel specifically and preserving the poetic structure that underscores God's enduring benevolence. This aligns with what we know of the Psalms of Solomon's theology and poetics. Understanding this small textual variant has broader implications. It is more than a trivial detail of textual transmission. It teaches us about the nature of ancient manuscript production, the vulnerability of texts to scribal slips, and the importance of careful scholarly reconstruction. By recognizing that the presence of Israel at the end of one colon rather than the next affects not only the text's literary elegance but also its theological clarity, we see how crucial textual criticism is for arriving at a reliable edition of the text. In the classroom context, guiding students through such a variant helps them appreciate the complexities of ancient textual witnesses. They learn that textual criticism is not simply about comparing words on a page, but about understanding how a text was physically represented, copied, and preserved. Every manuscript is a material artifact that brings its own peculiarities to the transmission process. In conclusion, the variant reading of Psalms of Solomon 11:7 underscores the importance of stichographic considerations and the perils of scribal misunderstanding. By reconstructing the likely original layout and tracing the process by which a scribe might have misread the stichography, we can restore a more coherent and authentic text. Such exercises deepen our appreciation for the textual critic's craft and the effort required to present ancient texts in editions that reflect as closely as possible their original form and intention. My second example is Psalms of Solomon 16. A hymn of Solomon as help for the devout. When my soul became drowsy, drifting away from the Lord, I nearly slipped into the downward pull of a sleep leading to death, far removed from God. My soul almost plunged into death, drawing near the gates of Hades alongside the sinner. As my soul was carried off from the Lord, the God of Israel, if the Lord had not taken hold of me in his everlasting mercy. He prodded me like a goat urges a horse, so that I would stay alert for him. My Savior and Helper rescued me at every moment. I will acknowledge you, O God, because you brought me to salvation and did not count me among sinners for destruction. Do not withdraw your mercy from me, O God, nor let memory of you depart from my heart even until death. Take command over me, O God, lest I fell into evil sin or be ensnared by any wicked woman who leads the foolish astray. Let not the beauty of a lawless woman deceive me, nor that of anyone who sinks into fruitless sin. Direct the works of my hands to your place, and guard my steps in your remembrance. Enwrap my tongue and lips with words of truth. Remove far from me all anger and irrational wrath. Keep murmuring and faint-heartedness in affliction away from me, should I sin while you are disciplining me for my return to you. But with goodwill and joyfulness steady my soul. When you strengthen my soul, what you give shall suffice for me. For if you do not strengthen me, who can endure correction in this hidden is poverty? When a soul is reproved by a hand of decay, your testing lies upon his flesh and in the distress of want. If a righteous one endures these trials, he shall receive mercy from the Lord. Psalms of Solomon 16 portrays the deeply personal spiritual struggle and divine intervention. The speaker comes perilously close to spiritual oblivion, likened to drifting from the protective presence of the Lord into the clutches of death and sin. The psalmist's vulnerability is palpable. Without the Lord's merciful grip, he would be lost among the ranks of sinners who face destruction. Here we glimpse a powerful insight. Human strength alone cannot withstand the downward pull of moral decay. Only God's mercy prevents the soul's ultimate collapse. God's engagement is neither distant nor dispassionate. Rather, the psalm likens divine intervention to a goat prodding a horse to remain alert, emphasizing that God's discipline is intended not to harm but to awaken and guide. Through this analogy, the poet testifies that rescue is not accidental. It is the deliberate, persistent work of a saving God who corrects and restores. Central to the psalm's theology is the recognition that human beings cannot flourish in isolation from their Creator. Moral strength does not come from innate human virtue alone. It is nurtured and sustained by God's mercy and guidance. The psalmist prays for purity of speech and steadiness of hand, knowing that his deeds and words must align with divine truth. He also acknowledges the reality of temptation, from seductive influences to corrosive anger and impatience, pleading for divine protection and moral clarity. At a more profound level, the psalm's insistence on remembrance, both the psalmist's remembrance of God and God's merciful refusal to forget his own, affirms an enduring covenant relationship. Material poverty, moral testing, and inner struggle become the fields in which God's mercy takes root and bears fruit. Enduring God's discipline is not a sign of abandonment, but rather of divine investment in human integrity and redemption. Psalm 16 provides a reassuring portrait of this spiritual journey, one that may lead dangerously close to the abyss, yet does not end there, thanks to a merciful God who intervenes, corrects, and restores. Academically, the text invites careful attention to its imagery and textual variants, enriching our understanding of how such ancient poetry communicated spiritual truths amid the complexities of its linguistic and manuscript traditions. Our second example of textual criticism from the Psalms of Solomon is a subtle yet theologically and contextually significant variant in Psalms of Solomon 16, verses 13 to 14. Once again, we find that a scribal misinterpretation, specifically involving the placement of the pronoun autou, has likely distorted the intended sense of the original passage. By examining this instance, we shall observe how even a minor pronoun shift can produce a nonsensical reading and how textual critics determine the most plausible original text. In the preserved manuscripts, we encounter the following readings for these verses. Verse 13 includes the phrase "en penia autou" in his poverty, attested in the critical editions of von Gebhardt and Ralph Hannard. And verse 14a, however, is transmitted as encheiresia prias autou by his rotten, decaying hand in the Greek manuscripts and the same critical editions. The problem emerges immediately in verse 14a. The phrase "by his rotten hand" appears both contextually awkward and syntactically peculiar. We must ask, to whom does his refer, and what role does a rotten hand play in this poetic unit? Without a clear referent for a coherent metaphor, this reading does not make much sense within the thematic flow of verses 13 and 14. The troublesome autou in verse 14a most likely does not belong there. Instead, it was originally associated with verse 14, where it fits comfortably as in his poverty and penia autou. By restoring the pronoun to verse 13, we retain a coherent phrase that describes a state or condition attributable to a particular individual or as an entity. The resulting reconstruction looks as follows: verse 13, "and penia autou in his poverty," and verse 14a, "encheiresia prias by a rotten, decaying hand." This revised reading for verse 14a describes an action or situation without forcing an unnatural possessive pronoun onto the rotten hand phrase. The image of rotten hand, presumably a metaphor for moral corruption, decay, or ineffective agency, stands on its own. The text is thus delivered from an exegetical crux that had no plausible solution in the prior reading. How can we explain this scribal mishap? Well, a scribe grappling with line lengths and the stichographic layout of the text inadvertently misplaced the pronoun. Consider the likely scenario. The end of verse 13 was too long for the line, prompting the scribe to write the autou, the final word of verse 13, in a position slightly below or after the line break. In many ancient manuscripts, where spacing was limited and punctuation absent or minimal, such adjustments were common practice. And this was exactly the same case in our preceding example from Psalms of Solomon 11. A subsequent copyist, encountering autou in an unusual or ambiguous position, naturally assumed that it belonged to the next line, that is, to the phrase "encheiresia prias" in verse 14. This scribal error would have seemed logical at the time, but it created a nonsense reading from a modern critical perspective. Essentially, the error resulted from a momentary lapse in the careful delineation of textual units, a reminder that every step in the transmission process can introduce confusion. Textual criticism requires the careful weighing of contextual coherence, grammatical plausibility, and manuscript evidence to determine the best possible reading. By removing autou from verse 14 and placing it back where it likely originated at the end of verse 13, the reconstructed text regains internal logic. The progression from verse 13 to verse 14 no longer hinges on an inexplicable possessive pronoun. Instead, the text proceeds from describing a state of poverty clearly belonging to an implied subject, to presenting a subsequent image involving a rotten hand, presumably symbolizing decay, judgment, or negative influence depending on the broader literary context of the Psalms of Solomon. This case highlights several key lessons for students of textual criticism. Minor details, major effects. Even a single pronoun can significantly alter our understanding of a text. A small slip by a scribe can cast an entire phrase into confusion. And context is a guide. When confronted with a puzzling reading, contextual and thematic coherence becomes a powerful diagnostic tool. The critic must ask whether the text makes sense in its literary and theological setting. And the awareness of scribal practices, understanding how ancient copyists managed line breaks, spacing, and stichographic layouts is essential. Many textual corruptions arise not from doctrinal bias or deliberate alteration, but simply from the physical and visual constraints of manuscript production. And the value of conjectural emendation. Although editors prefer to rely on manuscript evidence, conjectural emendation can be justified when the extant readings produce clear nonsense. In this instance, restoring autu to verse 13 is not an arbitrary guess, but a measured judgment grounded in logic and paleographic insight. By tracing the journey of a single pronoun and its mishandling by an anonymous scribe, we gain deeper insight into the complexities of textual transmission. The restored text now reads more naturally, no longer burdened by an ill-fitting pronoun. Such instances remind us that textual criticism is not only a technical, philological exercise, but also a kind of detective work, piecing together clues left by scribes to recover an approximation of the original text. In sum, the textual difficulties in Psalms of Solomon 16:13-14 exemplify how careful attention to line division, scribal habits, and contextual sense can guide scholars to more authentic and meaningful readings of the biblical texts. My third and last example is Psalms of Solomon 17. A psalm of Solomon accompanied by a song for the king. O Lord, you yourself are our king forever and ever, for in you, O God, our soul will boast. And what is the length of a human life on earth? According to his own lifespan, so is his hope set upon it. But we shall hope in God our Saviour, for the power of our God endures forever with mercy, and the kingdom of our God stands forever over the nations through justice. You, O Lord, chose David as king over Israel, and you swore to him concerning his lineage for all eternity, that his royal line would never fail before you. Yet in our sins, sinners rose up against us. They attacked and drove us away, those whom you had not promised. By force they seized, and they did not honor your glorious name. In their arrogance they established the kingship as if in high estate. They laid waste the throne of David with usurping pride. But you, O God, will cast them down and remove their offspring from the earth, and against them arises a man foreign to our race. According to their sins you will repay them, O God, so that they are dealt with according to their deeds. God will not show them mercy. He has searched out their seed and left not one of them. Faithful is the Lord in all his judgment that he executes upon the earth. The lawless one devastated our land of its inhabitants. They made youth and elder along with their children disappear. In anger he sent also his nations against them, as far as the western reaches, and even the rulers of the land were mocked, and he spared not. In estrangement the enemy acted with arrogance, and his heart was aligned to our God. And all that he did in Jerusalem was as the nations do in their cities with their gods, and they held sway over them. The sons of the covenant were among mixed peoples, and in their midst in Jerusalem none practiced mercy or truth. Those who loved gatherings of the devout fled from them. Like sparrows they flew out of their bedding nests. They wandered in deserts seeking to save their lives from evil, and precious in the eyes of the community was a life saved from among them. Across the whole earth they were scattered by lawless ones, for heaven withheld its rain from the earth. Eternal springs from the deep were restrained by high mountains, for there was no one among them who practiced justice and righteousness. From the ruler down to the least of the people all were in sin, the king in lawlessness, the judge in disobedience, and the people in sin. Look, O Lord, and raise up for them their king, the son of David, at the time you have chosen, O God, for your servant to reign over Israel. Gird him with strength to crush unrighteous rulers, to cleanse Jerusalem from the nations that trample it to destruction. To in wisdom and righteousness drive sinners from the inheritance, to shatter the pride of the sinner like pottery, to smash all their power with an iron rod, to destroy lawless nations with the word of his mouth, to make nations flee from before him by his mere threat, and to convict sinners by the reasoning of their hearts. He shall gather a holy people whom he shall lead in righteousness, and he will judge the tribes of the people sanctified by the Lord his God. He will not allow injustice to dwell among them any longer, nor shall anyone who knows wickedness live among them. For ye shall know that they are all sons of their God. He shall settle them by their tribes upon the land, and no foreigners or outsiders shall dwell among them any longer. He shall judge nations and peoples in the wisdom of his righteousness. And he shall have the peoples of the nations serve him under his yoke, and he shall glorify the Lord with a notable sign before all the earth, and he shall purify Jerusalem in holiness as in the beginning. So that nations come from the ends of the earth to behold his glory, bringing as gifts her sons who were utterly weakened, and to see the glory of the Lord with which God has glorified her. That means Jerusalem. And he is a righteous king, taught by God to rule over them, and no injustice shall be found in his days among them, for they are all holy, and their king is the anointed Lord. For he will not rely on horse or rider or bow, nor accumulate gold and silver for war, nor place his hopes in money for the day of battle. The Lord himself is his king, the hope of the mighty and hope of God, and he shall have mercy on all the nations who stand before him in fear. For he shall strike the earth by the word of his mouth forever, and he shall bless the people of the Lord in wisdom and with rejoicing. He himself is pure from sin, worthy to govern a great people, to reprove rulers and uproot sinners by the power of his word. And he shall not grow weak in his days before his God, for God has worked in him might through the Holy Spirit, and wisdom through counsel of understanding with strength and righteousness. The blessing of the Lord is with him in might, and he shall not weaken. His hope is in the Lord, and who can prevail against him? Mighty in his works and strong in the fear of God, he shepherds the Lord's flock in faith and justice. And he will not allow any to become weak among them in their pasture. Iniquity he will guide them all, and there shall be no arrogance among them, no oppression to subdue them. This is the splendor of the King of Israel, whom God has known, to raise him over the house of Israel, to instruct it. His words are refined beyond the most precious gold. In assemblies he shall discern the tribes of a sanctified people, and his words shall be like the words of holy ones among sanctified nations. Blessed are those who shall live in those days, to see the good things of Israel and the gathering of the tribes which God shall do. May God hasten his mercy upon Israel, and delivers us from the defilement of profane enemies. The Lord himself is our King forever and ever. Psalm of Solomon 17 stands as one of the most significant and theologically charged compositions within the Psalms of Solomon. It envisions a dramatic restoration of Israel under a divinely appointed Davidic ruler who embodies and enacts God's perfect justice and holiness. To appreciate this psalm's depth, we must examine its historical context, its theological visions, and the resonances it stirs in the hearts of readers, both ancient and modern. At its core, Psalm 17 confronts a crisis of leadership and morality. The text paints a grim portrait of an Israel seemingly forsaken, plagued by foreign domination and internal corruption. The throne of David, once divinely guaranteed, has been usurped by leaders who are not only illegitimate but also morally bankrupt. The psalmist laments the scattering of God's covenant people among mixed nations, the breakdown of communal and the absence of divine blessings such as rainfall. This dire situation arises from a profound fracture. The people, from their rulers to the least among them, have stayed straight from justice and obedience. By depicting political ruin, social fragmentation, and environmental hardship, the psalm underscores the unity of God's moral order. When covenant fidelity deteriorates, all spheres of life, political, social, and even natural, suffer. In response, the psalm presents the vision of a new king, a son of David, chosen and empowered by God. Unlike flawed human monarchs who rely on military might, wealth, or cunning, this messianic figure places no trust in horses, riders, gold, or silver. His authority derives wholly from the Lord, and his task is nothing less than re-establishing the divine order on earth. This future ruler will shatter the pride of the sinner, drive out injustice, and restore Jerusalem to its sacred integrity. The psalm's language aligns closely with other Second Temple Jewish messianic expectations, where the anticipated deliverer is both a royal agent and a moral reformer, embodying the ideals of the covenant. From a theological perspective, the psalm's reliance on divine promises and the Davidic covenant is striking. The author recalls that God once sought to maintain David's lineage forever. The psalmist does not question this promise. He clinges to it as a source of hope amid calamity. By invoking God's oath, the community testifies that divine faithfulness outlasts human faithlessness. Even the corruptions of present and past regimes cannot overturn God's eternal decree. Another key theological theme is the interplay between God's mercy and justice. While the psalm insists that certain adversaries, those who oppress, desecrate, and spread lawlessness, will receive no mercy, it also proclaims God's enduring compassion toward all the nations who stand before him in awe. This dual emphasis reflects a sophisticated understanding of divine governance. God's saving acts arise from his covenantal mercy, but that mercy does not preclude the righteous judgment of entrenched evil. The Messianic king, as the conduit of God's will, must restore moral clarity, ensuring that oppression and wickedness find no foothold among God's people. The psalm's Messianic vision transcends a narrow nationalism. While it certainly speaks of purifying Israel and restoring Jerusalem, it also depicts a scene where nations stream from the ends of the earth to witness God's glory. These foreigners come bearing the weakened sons of Israel, a poignant sign that reconciliation and healing extend to the diaspora and beyond. The notion that all become aware they are sons of their God points to an enlarged vision of divine kinship. Under this righteous ruler, divisions cease and the community flourishes in peace, equity, and truth. The ultimate outcome is the establishment of a worldwide order defined not by conquest or xenophobia, but by reverence for the one true God and obedience to his revealed justice. For contemporary readers, be they believers or seekers of meaning in ancient texts, Psalm 17 resonates on multiple levels. Historically, it recalls the turbulence of the late Second Temple period, possibly reflecting the trauma of Roman interference or the usurpation by foreign dynasts like Herod the Great. In that era, Israel longed for a leader who would restore not only political autonomy but moral righteousness. The psalm channels that longing into a hopeful expectation. A future ruler would fuse divine teaching with kingly authority, guiding the people into fidelity and holiness. Pastorally, this psalm offers comfort and challenge alike. Comfort arises from its unwavering confidence that God's promises endure, that no human failure can finally annul the divine covenant. Even when corruption runs rampant and hope grows dim, the faithful can trust that God's plan will prevail. The challenge lies in recognizing that the awaited king is not merely a political liberator, but a moral exemplar. His reign demands that God's people shed their own complicity in injustice. The psalm suggests that God's chosen leader cannot usher in a new era unless the people themselves return to covenant faithfulness. And theologically, the psalm navigates a complex web of themes: covenant fidelity, divine kingship, messianic expectation, and the transformation of the world. Its vision extends beyond Israel's borders, envisioning a reordered cosmos in which nations acknowledge the Lord's sovereignty. This cosmic scope and moral dimension resonate with later messianic interpretations found in various Jewish and Christian traditions. Some early Christian interpreters saw in this psalm's language a foreshadowing of Christ's ministry. Though originally composed in a different religious milieu, the psalm's universalizing and moral thrust laid a foundation upon which later theological readings could build. In some, Psalm of Solomon 17 offers a majestic tapestry of hope in a time of despair, moral clarity in an age of corruption, and divine permanence against the flux of human history. It weaves together lament over current injustice with confidence in God's unbreakable promise, culminating in the promise of a righteous king who will restore right order. By pondering this text, readers gain insight into an ancient community's yearnings, discover a theological framework that integrates mercy and judgment, and encounter a messianic hope that challenges both their ethical commitments and their understanding of divine action in the world. In verse 7, the psalmist speaks of a figure who arises against the corrupt regime, a man foreign to our race. Historically, this phrase has often been interpreted as referring to Herod the Great, an Idumean ruler placed over Judea by Roman authority. Unlike the Davidic line of ancient Israel, Herod did not share the same ethnic or familiar heritage, making him an outsider in both lineage and covenant identity. Theologically, this detail underscores the psalm's lament that foreign or illegitimate power holders gained authority where a legitimate, divinely sanctioned dynasty was expected. Although Herod's reign temporarily usurped the Davidic throne, the psalm promises that God will ultimately remove his foreign seat, reaffirming the conviction that divine purposes cannot be thwarted by non-conventional covenantal rulers. The phrase Christos Kyrios, the anointed Lord, in verse 32, stands out as a rare and potentially perplexing title. In the Psalms of Solomon, Christos simply means anointed, deriving from the Hebrew term Messiah. Here it does not carry the post-New Testament Christian connotation, but signals a divinely appointed royal figure who embodies God's will. The pairing with Kyrios, Lord, intensifies the dignity and authority of this future king. While some editors and interpreters have suggested that this reading might be a Christian emendation, textual evidence and internal logic support the authenticity of Christos Kyrios. In the context of the psalm, it designates a ruler whose legitimacy and sanctity are unparalleled, one who presides without injustice and reflects divine holiness. Thus, the phrase characterizes this messianic king as a genuine, God-taught sovereign, fully authorized to restore and rule God's people in righteousness. The vision of nations streaming to Jerusalem from the ends of the earth, bearing gifts and acknowledging God's glory, introduces a universal dimension to what initially seems like a nationalistic hope. While the psalm calls for the purification of Israel and the re-establishment of Davidic rule, it does not end with ethnic exclusivism. Instead, it anticipates a time when foreign peoples, previously conquerors or outsiders, recognized the divine majesty radiating from Jerusalem. This motive resonates with broader Second Temple Jewish literature and later Christian and Jewish eschatologies, where the Messiah's reign ultimately brings about worldwide acknowledgement of the God of Israel. Theologically, this broadened scope suggests that the Messianic era will reconcile not only Israel to its God, but also the nations to just and divine order, demonstrating that holiness and righteousness have implications far beyond Israel's borders. Our third and final example from the Psalms of Solomon brings us to what many consider one of the most challenging textual cruxes in the corpus. The reading at Psalms of Solomon 1732. This passage has attracted considerable attention as it appears to position the figure at issue, presumably a royal or messianic leader, under a distinctive title, Christos Kyrios, the Anointed Lord or the Lord's Anointed. Understanding the debate surrounding this phrase offers valuable insights into how scholars navigate uncertain textual evidence, weigh conjectural emendations, and assess the probability of Christian influence on a pre-Christian Jewish text. In all extant Greek manuscripts of the Psalms of Solomon, we encounter a unified reading, Christos Kyrios. The Syriac version similarly supports this wording with its translation Meshiach Maya, indicating that the earliest textual witnesses present no known variant. Although this phrase might initially strike some readers as suggestive of a Christian interpretation, after all, Christos is commonly associated with Christ, one must be cautious. In Second Temple Jewish contexts, Christos is simply the Greek rendering of anointed, Mashiach, oder Mashiach, and Messiah, and Kyrios Lord often appears as a title of respect or sovereignty. Despite the anonymity of the manuscripts, some scholars have found Christos Kyrios puzzling. Following the path set by Ewald and Wellhausen, 19th century, the editor von Gebhardt, end of 19th century, argued that this was a mistaken translation or a misunderstood phrase. Carrière, on the other hand, suggested that the text should be amended to Christos Kyrio, the anointed of the Lord, a more familiar Old Testament formula. This conjecture was accepted by Rives and Hannard, among others, who proposed that Christos Kyrios might be the result of a Christian emendation introduced at some point during the text's transmission. The logic behind this proposed change is straightforward. Christos Kyrio appears frequently in the Septuagint and stands in continuity with the Hebrew Bible's messianic or royal contexts. That means references to kings or other anointed figures, literally the Lord's anointed. Christos Kyrios, conversely, seems less idiomatic, giving rise to suspicions that a scribe's error or a theologically motivated alteration might have produced it. There are three substantial objections to the hypothesis of a Christian emendation. Nature of Christian additions. Rives observed certain Christian additions to the Psalter, yet these additions are generally recognizable as expansions or marginal insertions, not alterations of the existing wording. If the Christian redactors of the text were inclined to emphasize their theological understanding, we would expect them to add clarifying notes or supplementary phrases, not to subtly alter an existing phrase into an unprecedented form. In comparison with the Septuagint tradition, if Christos Kyrios were the product of a widespread Christian scribal corruption, one would anticipate some instability or variation in other comparable passages within the Septuagint. Yet we do not find analogous cases of stable textual corruption that produce a distinctively Christian phrase without corresponding manuscript variation. The uniformity of the tradition here argues against an ad hoc Christian modification. And the third, lack of familiarity in Christian usage. The phrase Christos Kyrios is not a standard Christian expression. Early Christian texts prefer terms such as for Christos, the Christ, or for Kyrios, Jesus, the Lord Jesus, clear, recognizable Christological titles. By contrast, Christos Kyrios, as an isolated phrase, would not serve an obvious theological agenda for early Christian scribes, making it an unlikely target for Christianizing emendation. Arguments challenged the need for a conjectural emendation to Christos Kyrio and cast doubt on the idea that Christos Kyrios is a Christian intrusion into the text. Given the weight of the manuscript evidence, the Syriac support and the logical objections to viewing the phrase as a Christian innovation, there is good reason to accept Christos Kyrios as its original. From a literary and historical perspective, the phrase can be understood as a royal or messianic title. The immediate context of Psalms of Solomon 17:32 describes a righteous king who rules in accordance with God's will. The text twice predicates Basileus, king of this figure, making it perfectly natural to interpret Kyrios as a regal honorific. In the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, Lord was not an exclusively divine epithet. It could function as a term of honor addressed to rulers or those in power. Thus, Christos Kyrios need not reflect a Christian theological assertion. Rather, it likely denotes the anointed Lord or King in a Jewish messianic setting, anticipating a leader who embodies divine approval and guidance. In this context, Lord Kyrios is simply the appropriate title for a divinely sanctioned monarch. This case demonstrates the complexity of determining the authenticity and provenance of particular readings. The temptation to suspect a Christian emendation arises naturally when one encounters a phrase that resonates with post-Second Temple theological language. Yet textual criticism requires an even-handed weighing of evidence. Manuscript evidence over conjecture. Since all known witnesses, including the Syriac, support Christos Kyrios, conjectural changes to Christos Kyrio must be approached with caution. The burden of proof rests on those advocating for the emendation. And then contextual cohesion. The reading must be evaluated against the passage's literary context. Here, the consistent identification of the figure as a king and the normal ancient Near Eastern use of titles such as Lord for rulers strengthen the case for the received text. And awareness of ideological biases. Scholarly suspicion of Christian involvement in textual transmission can, if left unchecked, lead to overly skeptical approaches. While Christian interpolations and modifications are not unheard of, they must be demonstrated rather than assumed. In conclusion, Psalms of Solomon 17:32, far from constituting an insoluble crux, invites a careful re-examination of the evidence and the assumptions guiding our textual decisions. The reading Christos Kyrios is neither demonstrably corrupt nor peculiarly Christian. Interpreted against the backdrop of ancient royal ideology and the messianic expectations characteristic of the Psalms of Solomon, the phrase emerges as an authentic and meaningful expression of an anointed, divinely approved ruler. As such, it stands as a testament to the importance of cautious, contextually grounded textual criticism in the study of early Jewish literature. We've explored three instructive examples of textual criticism drawn from the Psalms of Solomon. Preserved within multiple manuscript traditions, these texts provided fertile ground for understanding how scribal practices, sticographic arrangements, that means line divisions, and misunderstandings of layout can lead to textual corruption. One key lesson emerges: we should trust in the manuscripts themselves. At the same time, exercise caution when scholars propose altering the biblical text. The text-critical apparatus of the Göttingen Septuagint editions allows you to examine the manuscript tradition independently, enabling you to review editorial decisions and even reach your own text-critical conclusions. Thank you very much for your attention, and the floor is open to your questions.
Okay, vielen lieben Dank, yeah, Dr. Albrecht. Thank you so much for your
One
interesting
moment.
presentation.
One moment.
Okay,
Ja, hallo?
hello.
Ja, gut. Okay.
Great. Once again, vielen lieben Dank for your presentation, Herr Dr. Albrecht. And thank you
Ja,
so much for your interesting and with both introducing the book of the Psalms of Solomon, but also analyzing it. So we come to the question and answers and discussions. Please, if anyone would like to give some questions. You can put it in the chat box or you can raise your hand. Well, while we are waiting, maybe I can ask my question. Because there's no one raising their hand and there's no question in the chat box. So I'm going to ask the first question from my question. So my question is rather regarding the language of the text. What I noticed from
ja,
the text of Psalmi Solomonis is the appearance of the alliterations and even omotoloiton in the Greek text. For example, in the beginnings of chapter 1, verses 7 and 8, E amartie afton, their sins, and also in verse 8, it is kind of repeated. E anomie afton, their transgressions, or even alliteration and omoteloton in the form of repetition in chapter 16, as you presented, especially in verses 10c compared to 11b. I read it briefly. Makaran pieson epemu, and in verse 11b, makrinon apemu, remove or take away from me. Or in chapter 17 as well, as you presented, in almost every line, I found the words like megalu, logu, aftu in verses 36 repeatedly. Do you think that the Greek text of Psalmi Solomon we have today is a translation from Hebrew or Aramaic original text? Do you think this alliteration or moteleton are a matter of translation? Or maybe is it an indication that the original text was even in Greek?
yeah. So in my opinion, this text might have had a core, let's say, written in Hebrew or
Mhm.
Aramaic, but the text as it is transmitted
Mm.
is, in my opinion, composition Greek. So I dealt with other books of the Septuagint before. So with the 12 Minor Prophets, I revised the edition by Ziegler of the 12 Minor Prophets, and I analyzed the variation, the text critical variation there. And there is the phenomenon in other books of the Septuagint, prophetical books, or even in the Psalms of David, in the Davidic Psalter, that if there occurs a variation, a variant reading, there is a high probability that you can explain it on the basis of the Hebrew. That means of a different Hebrew vocalization. That's the case in the 12 Minor Prophets. In many cases, if there is a variation, two variant readings opposing, you can see, okay, it's the same consonantal text, Hebrew text, but differently vocalized. And for the Psalms of Solomon, when I prepared the critical edition, I observed nothing like that. So there was no variant reading I could not explain from the Greek um, alone. And so it was all explainable from the Greek. And that is, in my opinion, a clear indication that it is composition Greek. So the text, in my opinion, came into being in, let's say, if there might have been a core, it might be during the Hasmonean time. That is something which we could think of because during that time, King Solomon played an important role. So there was a phase of restoration, let's say, after the Maccabean revolt. And there was, let's say, a nationalistic approach, and King David and King Solomon, they were figures of identification. And so that is something I could imagine that Psalms, so for instance, if we look into the Davidic Psalter, we see that the final psalms, so the Psalm 144 following, etc. So they are something I would say show in the Septuagint influence from the Maccabean period. And then you have the Psalm 151 and the Davidic Psalter, which is a clear, this biographic poem on David. And this is an indication to me that during that time, 2nd century BC, Jewish nationalism was on its highest level, let's say, and King Solomon was the figure of identification. So, and that means this could be the time where those same psalms came into being. And then they were, in my opinion, composed and written during the 1st century BC and finalized during the time of Agrippa I, 41 to 44, but in a Jewish milieu. So although this is after the time of Jesus, so in the early Christian, let's say, time, in my opinion, the Psalms of Solomon, so they were transmitted in Pharisaic circles. That's my idea. And we have an expectation related to Agrippa I that he was the Jewish Messiah, expected Messiah. So there is this rule that, so as a grandson of King Herod, there is this rule that this was not problematic anymore from perspective of Davidic lineage. So, and we see that this, let's say this was the mood of that time in the 40s of the 1st century AD. And in my opinion, this was what we find in the Psalms of Solomon. Let's say it's an expectation of the Jewish people of the time of Jesus Christ, but it's something which is independent from Christianity, let's say. And you see it in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Luke. There you find the only example of Christos Kyrios. It's there, and in my opinion is that this is some influence of this Pharisaic milieu and the Psalms of Solomon. So the Psalms of Solomon 17 and 18 are the most, I would say, most important example of a Jewish expectation of a Davidic Messiah we have. So it's the earliest text we have with that Davidic Messiah expectation. And in my opinion, it's something which is untouched by Christianity. So it's a text of its own. Yeah.
Okay, so if you say that the milieu of this text is the Pharisaic milieu, it means that it is rather nationalistic to the Jewish movement, Jewish independent movement. But how do you explain the emergence in the Greek language context? Because the Greek language context is you can say that it is colonial power in that time. If you write something in the colonial power in the colonial context, you can't put them together with the Pharisaic movement and Pharisaic milieu because it is against the colonial powers.
So you would say that it is unlikely that the text composed in Greek is something related to the Pharisaic milieu?
Maybe, because if you produce, because like, for example, the Yamnia Council, they are trying to remove the Hellenistic text, including Greek texts, even though it is Jewish, but it is not Jewish enough even though they were written by the Jews, but it was not really Jewish enough if they were written in Hellenistic language, which is the Greek language. So what is your opinion about that?
My opinion is that it is complicated. If you look at the Pharisees, we have the perspective of Josephus. So, and that is something which is post-Christian, a post-Christian perspective, let's say. And so we have, of course, the strong movement, that rabbinic movement, that Hebrew came again into being. But this is something, in my opinion, so that's my personal opinion, That's a counter movement to the Christian adaptation of the Septuagint. If you look into the New Testament, what you find is that the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, is the text the New Testament relates to. So there are a few examples where you have, let's say, what you have are different Greek texts laying in the background. So, for instance, in the Acts, in Acta, you have a kind of Taige, for instance, tradition in the Joel text prophecy. So that is something you find. So there is a different, let's say, so there are Jewish recensions in the background of the New Testament, not the Septuagint alone. So a modified, let's say, Septuagint tradition. But the Hebrew is not the reference, let's say, for the New Testament. And if you, when the New Testament came into being in the first century AD, in my opinion, this adaptation of the Septuagint of the Greek Old Testament, which was transmitted in the Jewish community, was, let's say, that was the reason that Judaism um, um, focused again on the Hebrew tradition. So it's a counter movement. So, and you see that this is what happens in the second century, that they all try to, for Aquila, this tradition that you really want to represent the Hebrew, underlying Hebrew of the Greek. That is something, so which is, in my opinion, a counter movement to that. And if you now go to Israel, you see when you arrive at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, you see a huge mosaic, Greek mosaic. So it was Hellenized. It was Israel was strongly Hellenized during the turn of the era. So the rabbinic movement, in my opinion, is something which develops as a reaction to this Christianization, let's say, of the Septuagint, but that does not mean that the Christian tradition altered the Old Testament. So that's something I'm strongly against this view. So the text was not, there is not any orthodox corruption of scripture. Right? That's my point.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your answer. I think we can move to the next question because there is someone already raised his hand. Mr. Stephanus Kanadi, you can, yeah, go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jenry and Dr. Albrecht for the very interesting presentation. Would you please comment on one of the verse that you read, which have the word Holy Spirit? Because it sounded very Christian. Like in the Old Testament, usually it's the Spirit of God, but you have the word Holy Spirit. That would you like to comment on that? Thank you.
The Holy Spirit. Yes, this is something. So we have some things. So the Hagioi is also something. Also Hagios is the one thing, the holy, but we have also the Hagioi, and this is something. Sorry, I will answer your question immediately, but the thing is, this is something which is Pharisaic. The idea of angels intervening, and those are the Hagioi which are mentioned in our text. So this is the interpretation of those. And the Holy Spirit, what verse is it? Can you please?
I don't remember. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, and so in my opinion, so what I wrote myself is that I think there might have been an interplay with early Christianity, so that this community of the Psalms of Solomon was in, let's say, like you see it in the Gospels. You see that Jesus was debating with the Pharisees, mostly with the Pharisees. So, and this is something I would not exclude. So it is possible that they spoke, they talked, they discussed those topics, let's say. And this might be the reason for this, that you find something which seems Christian. But it's, in my opinion, the Psalms of Solomon are a prophecy. So they are a prophecy. They, of course, for Jesus Christ, that's for sure. So Christos Kyrios is Jesus Christ. In our perspective, in our Christian perspective, it's Jesus Christ. But it's a prophecy. So it's something which is antedates, let's say, the gospel traditions.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Great. We have another question as well from Mr. Johan. Please, you can go ahead with your question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gendry. Thank you, Dr. Felix, for the presentation. It's very interesting. I think you're the first person in my life that presents Psalms of Solomon in 1 hour with high spirit. So it's really interesting for me. When I saw your conclusion or summary that we must trust in the manuscripts and be careful when scholars propose altering the biblical text, what come out in my thought is we don't need to learn about Song of Solomon to reach this conclusion. However, I believe that God put certain interest or fire on our heart for certain issue. So like just now when Brother Alexander shared why he very attracted to the second Maccabees, for me that it sounds like his inner sanctum. So would you mind to share with us why you have this interest in the first time? What are you looking for when you start studying the Psalm of Solomon? What God put in your heart? Something like that. But I think this is kind of personal, but if you don't want to share, I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So the thing is, I was from the very beginning interested in King Solomon. So that I dealt with the wisdom of Solomon. So I produced a German translation of the wisdom of Solomon. And of course, with the Psalms of Solomon and the Testament of Solomon. I don't know if you have heard about the Testament of Solomon, which is the story of the temple building with the help of the demons. So King Solomon is subduing the demons, and they help him to build the temple in a very short time. So, and this is something I'm very much interested in. So I'm interested in the Solomonic tradition, and that means really from the biblical traditions, the very beginnings, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, of course, and to the very end, and that means the Testament of Solomon, the hygromancy of Solomon. So he did also some mantic. So there's a tradition of the mantic, the magic, let's say, magical King Solomon, and this is something I'm very interested in. There are a lot of texts which are not edited so far. So the hygromancy of Solomon is something which is you can look into it, but it's not let's say there is no critical edition you can rely on. And so I did it with a Testament of Solomon that I
fantastic.
prepared, let's say, a critical edition for yeah.
But when you start this, you know that not much people think that Psalm of Solomon is written by Solomon, right? You know that, or you don't know at the first.
Yes. So it's, in my opinion, it's not, of course, it's not written by Solomon.
Okay.
So it's not written by Solomon. So, but it's the tradition, the Solomonic tradition. So that means it would not make so the texts would not make sense, let's say, if they would be placed in the time of Solomon. There are, of course, Solomonic psalms, and if you look into the Psalter, you have two, in the Davidic Psalter. So it's something different. But here it's a text which is, let's say it's ascribed to Solomon, But what does it
Oh,
mean that it's ascribed to Solomon? So it means that it's a prophecy of the Davidic Solomonic lineage, let's say. And it's a question. So why would someone ascribe this text to Solomon? That's one of the questions, of course, I had. But in this case, with the Psalms of Solomon, it's something which is really, so you have the Davidic Psalter, and it's the idea that this second Psalter is something which is, it's a later corpus, this Psalms of Solomon, but it reflects the Davidic Psalter. So if you look into the text, you find even references to the Septuagint of
yeah.
Psalms, of the canonical Psalms.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Felix.
Yeah.
All right. Is there any more question? Okay, from Alex. Yeah,
Thank
please.
you very much. Yeah, thank you, Jerry. Thank you very much for a great presentation. Unfortunately, one part I missed because I had some stuff with German bureaucracy, so I apologize if I'm asking something that was already been told. Of course, Psalms of Solomon, very, very interesting topic in general. And it's interesting to me that, for example, we have in the festive epistle of Athanasius that when he lists Apocrypha, he says those are the writings that are being given name of old authors, yada, yada, yada. He does not mention Psalm of Solomon, but we can assume that maybe he knows of them. What I wanted to ask, we have two other writings that are interesting to me, and I have no idea if they can be linked to the Psalms of Solomon. One is the Book of Odes, which actually consists of biblical songs that are later being used in early church worship. Are there any connection with them? Meaning, did anybody take Psalms of Solomon as a pattern, for example, to create a Book of Odes? And the second one, maybe a bit more interesting, we have also the so-called Odes of Solomon, which is also an additional corpus of the writings which were ascribed to Solomon. Are there any connections there? I know that they have been discovered more recently, so to say, compared to Psalms of Solomon, if I'm correct. So are there any connection there? And I'm sorry if you already talked about this in the presentation. As I said, one part of the presentation I had to miss. And once again, thank you, because that what I managed to grasp in here was really astonishing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So the thing with the odes and the psalms is a bit difficult. So if we look into the Psalter, that means the psalms and odes of the Septuagint. The odes is an appendix. So half of it are, let's say, text from the Old Testament, half of it text from the New Testament, and also church ecclesiastical texts at the end. So, and the thing is, this is something, this composition, which is of a later date. So the oldest manuscript we have is Codex Alexandrinus. So Codex Alexandrinus, 5th century, we have this composition. In my opinion, it's late. It's not as late as the 5th century. It's something which came earlier into being. In my opinion, it's the first half of the 3rd century that we have this connection with the psalms and odes as we find it in the Septuagint. So, and this is very interesting. You see that there was a reading tradition, let's say, in Judaism, which is quite old. So if you look into the odes, you find texts which are like the description, Deuteronomy 32 is a text which is very old, and it was, let's say, used as a prayer in really early Judaism. That means in pre-Christian times already, I would say, in the synagogues. So, and the same with other texts like Habakkuk 3. So this what is called appendix to Habakkuk, in my opinion, it's not an appendix, but so there you see that it has a very vivid tradition. So you have many different text types. You have it as part of the odes. You have it in the Septuagint, of course, in two different versions. So you have the Barberini version, which is named after a certain codex in the Barberini library in Rome, which has a different, let's say, a different text type. And you see, this is there is a strong reading tradition. And the Haftarot is some phenomenon, so that you have texts from the prophets which are read. This is something which is quite old. And this means that this composition of the odes, let's say, finalizes as we find it in the Codex Alexandrinus, something which came earlier into being. And then you have, in the same way as the Psalms of David and the odes of David, let's call it, were composed and connected, you have the same phenomenon with the Psalms of Solomon and the odes of Solomon. The odes of Solomon are clearly, so they are studied by Michael Latke. They were studied he did the texts and the commentaries, etc. And so it's a Christian tradition. That's clear. So it's nothing which is Jewish. He argued that at an earlier stage of his academic, let's say, career, he argued for even a Jewish core, but I'm not certain and not sure. I would say this is a Christian, and this is also his later view, a Christian composition, and you find it in the Syriac. So in the Syriac tradition of the Psalms of Solomon, you have this connection with the Odes of Solomon. You see that they are counted so differently, the Psalms. So you have the counting, and then you see in the Psalms of Solomon that the counting is so different that you see, okay, they formed the connection with the Psalms of Solomon, the Odes of Solomon. And you find it also in the canonical indices. So there you find this connection of Odes of Solomon, Psalms of Solomon, Odes of Solomon. So in my opinion, my view, Psalms of Solomon were at an early stage. That's what I explained at the beginning. They were connected with the wisdom books, and they stood after the wisdom of Solomon. You see it because you have a mistake in the tradition that the title is Sophia Solomontos in Ralph's 253. One Greek manuscript has it, and also one from the 7th century Syriac fragment has this ascription to the wisdom of Solomon. And this is explainable if you see that if you look into the biblical tradition, you have the title of a book and you have always the subscription in the older manuscripts. So, and it's repeated there, let's say. So you have at the beginning Sophia Solomontos, at the end Sophia Solomontos of a text. And if a copyist makes this mistake, that he copies it, or if the title, for instance, was lost of the following text, this came into being, this mistake, and you see clearly that in the very early tradition, you have this connection of the Psalms of Solomon with the Sophia Solomontos. So not in the main branch of the Septuagint tradition, but in a sub-branch, you have this connection of those two texts. So there is a relation. So from the very beginning, and then there was this edict that psalms which were not the biblical psalms were forbidden, let's say, in service. And that was the point where the Psalms of Solomon, let's say, went to the margins of the canon.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. I didn't think about it. We have the decisions of the Council of Laodicea, which says that only a book of 150 psalms should be read in the church. Probably that somebody also had in mind the Psalms of Solomon, and of course, probably different various psalms that were there at that time. Thank you for the answer.
Great. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Albrecht, for your wonderful explanations and really clear explanation and introduction to the book of the Psalmi Salomonis. I remember I read your book as actually Divaisat Salomos as I did my project on Kohelet, because Kohelet is also part of the Solomonic tradition. in the period of the Ptolemaic era. Well, our time is limited. I think we come to the end of the session. We would like to present you an online appreciation. So for the certificate as the speaker of this session. And thank you so much once again, Dr. Albrecht, for your time and your participation.
Thank you very much. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so
Okay. We will come to the closing session of this whole seminar.